Hello, welcome to another episode of Modern Cyber. We're doing something a little bit different today. This is, I think, for the first time, we're having two guests for the price of one. That is right, you're getting bonus content. But we're coming to you again live from the sidelines of Forward CloudSec. And I'm really excited to be joined by two people today who have deep experience in the industry. Jonathan, Rojan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Why don't you just take a second and introduce yourself to the audience? Rojan, why don't you kick things off?
Sure. So my name is Rojan. I've been doing security for about seven and a half years now.
Awesome.
And did mainly red teaming for the last 3.5 years, which was trying to find stuff about our company, trying to compromise it, act as an attacker, and have been doing that now at my new startup too.
Okay.
And I'll pass it to Jonathan.
Awesome.
Hi, my name's Jonathan. I originally started out racking and stacking servers into operations work and eventually into cloud security for about the last 10 years. And I also just founded a new security startup and doing a lot of cloud security elements.
Awesome. Well, it's great to talk to two founders. As a founder myself, it's always great to share some of those experiences. I also started with racking and stacking. I don't know if you have a particular least favorite thing that you ever had to rack and stack. For me, it was tape libraries. They were the absolute bane of my existence. I used to hate them, and I've definitely shredded at least the side of every fingernail along the way. But there's one topic in particular, with both of you kind of having a background from the red teaming side. There's something that I think a lot of people hear about, and that is like scanning, whether it's internet scanning, port scanning, kind of, enumerating networks, probing, etc. So first, as somebody coming from the backgrounds that you guys come from, where and how is that useful in your day-to-day work? And then what should other people who are, standing up infrastructure of their own know about this type of activity? I'll let either one of you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, especially if you worked in a data center, you may lose track of your assets over time, depending on the age of the systems. And it's a good way to get rough general asset inventory in some way, shape, or form,
okay,
especially of your own attack surface.
Okay.
So that's generally the way that I've approached it in the past, is using different scanning tools to be able to probe what's within our environment, both our internal and external attack surface. And in addition to that, help me sort of assess what the sort of environment looks like.
Yeah,
I would say same thing. Is like one good benefit is you will have a lot of assets you're missing.
Okay.
Usually whenever you are at a large scale organization, engineers are deploying things every day. It could be in a development environment, staging, and that's where you want to put effort in, is trying to use some public tool or even like proprietary tools and whatnot to find these assets, then go dig deeper. So from a red team point, it helps a lot to be like, okay, we have this missing asset that we didn't know about. Let's go and investigate that. And that might lead to a vulnerability that we have to go and fix, or that might lead to some like knowledge sharing with the engineering team, some kind of a training effort there as well.
Got it. And when we talk about assets in this context, are we focused on kind of like, let's say, the physical or physical equivalent asset? So like we know that there is a virtual machine, or are we thinking more kind of software inventory, software catalog?
I think it's a mixture of both. It's a mixture of both. So you'll see like things like on-premise endpoints that you have installed, so like VPNs, virtual like VirtualBox, VMware Horizons, and all of that.
Yeah.
You'll also start seeing more software in terms of like what the company has itself.
Yeah.
So they might have internal, like, as you are a security engineer, you'll have context of, okay, this software to us is an internal tool.
Yep.
It shouldn't be public.
Yeah.
Once you start seeing that in your asset inventory, you're like, okay, this is exposed. We need to go and investigate why it's exposed.
Yep.
Does it have any data that someone could exploit? So it gives you a mixture of both idea there.
Yeah, got it. And when you think about that, from a red teaming perspective, I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, one, obviously, it probably gives you let's say the first list of the things that you can kind of go after. But I'm also curious, like the step before that is, do you think it's indicative of organizations not having good release processes to know everything that's going live? And so you get this mismatch where you're scanning and you're finding a bunch of assets, but nobody's maintained an inventory, or maybe that inventory is like woefully out of date. I mean, what's kind of your experience there?
Absolutely. Asset inventory is difficult. No matter what environment you're in, whether it's in a cloud or in a data center, there have always been multiple solutions that I've used throughout the years, and not a single industry standard approach. And I wouldn't just blame it on the fact of a poor development lifecycle, but there's always going to be shadow IT in an organization, especially if you want to move fast and iterate. You want to go through a myriad of different tools and sort of take different approaches as you go. So you want to give a mixture of freedom to developers while having sort of a mature production environment.
Well, that's just what I was about to say. I mean, so this is your classic, like, hey, we're moving to the cloud, we're empowering our team. we're giving you the mandate to move fast and hopefully not, but break things, but, move fast, release quickly. And so to that end, you've got developers with full rights to push into prod, maybe push into, or at least push into staging, pretty much at a moment's notice. So, okay, so you run this initial scan, you get back this kind of asset inventory. It looks like whatever it looks like, a mix of, let's say, like IP addresses and endpoints, but then, software inventory, maybe you get some understanding about the frameworks and some of the core, third-party components that are in there. Is it mostly that kind of third-party stuff, or are you also picking up signatures of like custom internal code, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I would say it will be both custom and third-party. Custom is always really helpful to find. So one of the things when we're doing like at-scale scanning is looking for things. What kind of JavaScript do we have facing to the client side? Do we have any hard-coded credentials on this? Because we see that happen frequently is API keys are in client side that shouldn't be client side facing. Then you also see internal tools such as like your admin portal in some specific route. So when you start investigating certain routes, because once you start from getting the IP address and your domain, you then move into let's go and find weird paths or weird API endpoints that we can identify. One example, which is technically not internal, but helps a lot, is finding like API documentations. Things like Swagger JSON files, and like GraphQL endpoints. Because then you can write automations to say, okay, let me find all the API endpoints we have exposed. Let's make a category of those, especially if engineers are putting those API docs as expected public. You can start monitoring that for any changes. So even if your internal system misses it, saying like, let's say your internal release cycle misses that, your automation is still going to catch some of those. And that's where like some of these are really helpful, is even outside the software, you start getting some of those metrics and different test designs or categories that you can go and look for.
But this brings to mind like a question that I think, probably both of you with your experience are going to be able to really provide some insight on, which is what you just described sounds very helpful, but it sounds like a process with a lot of manual work that goes into it. So how do you do that at scale? Because I think, we're here at Forward cloudsec. We're seeing a lot of presentations that are really interesting, but then a lot of them talk about like, oh, this is a customer with 2,000 AWS accounts or whatever it is. And then I think about what you just described and trying to extract that out to 2,000 AWS accounts. That sounds like a nightmare. So what are some of the lessons learned? How should we be thinking about this differently?
I think one is like automations. One frequent that you'll see is like cron related jobs. You can create automations to start noticing and looking for patterns, and then writing like different pipelines for it. Like one thing that we did in our past job is trying to create like ECS and EKS like runners to go and start looking for domains and IP ranges and extract all of that data. The best part of that is there are open source tools now that helps with like extracting some of those, so you don't have to go and rebuild the wheel. You can go and just use that internally. There are like companies that do it as well, but if you're not interested in like using a product, you can go and build your own internally. The only difference there is now you have to go and maintain it. So that was the other issues we were seeing. I'll pass to Jonathan. He has built something cool with that too. So.
Yeah, so I've spent the last 10 years of my career scaling out applications at a significant scale. So this is sort of a problem that I've approached many, many times in my career, and something that I've, almost perfected the art in. And one approach that I have taken in the past was I created an open source tool in which you can run nuclei in parallel and invoke thousands of different instances of nuclei to perform scans of up to like 500K hosts in a matter of a few seconds. Whereas if you were to do that on one local machine, that could take you hours and hours and hours. So any way in which you can scale horizontally in order to perform those scans, that's definitely a good approach to take. There are also some other open source tools. I believe Secure Codebox is one of them that allows you, that is like a Kubernetes operator that allows you to run things like Nmap, nuclei, etc. as a Kubernetes controller. And you can use horizontal pod autoscaler in order to sort of scale that out as well. But I would definitely take approaches that many other companies have taken over the decade in terms of scaling out scans and sort of take that approach as well.
So let's say we solve the scaling out the scans and we solve the problem of being able to get data back in a meaningful time frame, but we now have the problem of understanding all that data that we get back. So you scale 500 or you scan 500K hosts, you're going to get back, I don't know, like 10 million findings of different types. I don't know what the right ratio to think about is of number of findings per host or findings per asset or how you think about it. But that also sounds like an overwhelming amount of data. And so from a red teaming perspective, maybe not even particularly from a red teaming perspective, but from the perspective of the customer and the organization, like that seems almost unmanageable to wade through. So how do you like contextualize and prioritize that once you get the data back?
Yeah, so that's a great point, because yes, you're right. You'll see like 500K domains, 100K are probably live. They might have multiple ports running, so you have that data. Each port might have its own data, and now you have a bunch of different data that you're storing. The best part about that is that's your context right there. So now you can start writing different logics to be like, okay, we are interested in certain things only. For example, you could say, I just want to see for my customer or show them only the ports that are open and the services that are running on them. So when a customer is listing out their domains or subdomains or their assets like IP range and everything, what they now see instead of all the million data at the first look is, here's one website that you have running. It's running port 80, port 8080, and it's running like a Jenkins or a GraphQL instance and others. So that provides them value of like, okay, that domain is not something we knew about yesterday. And now it has a service also running on it, which means there's probably some data. And then from there, you start giving them more context. So it's like kind of a step-by-step process for them to manually go as well. At the same time, you can take also a little bit of like a scripting at scale process to help the customers there, is if you know what they're interested in. When it comes to like for red teaming side, we want to know at least the early access points right away, right? If there's a way to get an RCE, if there's a way to get inside the server somehow or dump customer data, we want to know that as we're starting an engagement. So if you can write certain scripts to help find those vulnerabilities at scale on the data that were already found, and just display that, that's another value add to the customer. So you'll start adding all of those automations in place, and then slowly build out the UI on that. So instead of showing a million data points, you're just showing some that are all based on that. And as you do more scans, you just do a recursive approach of, here's this data, let's store it back, using another scan going forward. Now that's going to add more vulnerability. So it's just like a kind of a starting level pen test kind of thing, which you're automating.
And as you're going through those recursive steps, maybe like every step along the way, you add one additional kind of filter or one additional. What's really funny to me is that so many times in cybersecurity, we keep coming back to basically like data set, query, filter, filter, narrow, narrow. When I had somebody on the podcast a while ago talking about threat hunting, and I think the process they described was, you could take like change 4 or 5 words and he would have said the exact same thing that you just said to me, right? It's so interesting. I'm really curious about one thing in particular, maybe for you, Jonathan, with having done this for 10 years on the cloud. Okay, there is CSPM and there's CNAP, which if we're slightly pessimistic about it and let's apply some of the critical viewpoints onto it, it's really CSPM with an overlay of vulnerabilities on hosts, okay? Like just boiling it down in simplest terms, it's not that, I know it's not that. But for a lot of customers, that is primarily how they look at it. It's like, great, you've given me this big cloud inventory and now you've told me what's exposed to the world. And now I've correlated that with like, oh, this is an EC2 instance with port 22 open and log4j. And it also has 80 or 443 open. Crap, that's high priority, right? Like that's the kind of correlation, which by the way, also comes out of like data set, filter, query, narrowed down. I'm curious though, from let's say an internet scan versus CSPM perspective, have you ever looked at an exercise where you've tried to take those two things, like the results of your external scans and the results of the customer's internal, CNAP data and like match them up, and do they match?
Absolutely, and I definitely have a lot to add in this topic with over 8 years of experience in CSPM, CNAP tool equivalent. And I would say that at this point in time today, those tools are inadequate at performing attack surface assessments in a way that a tool like Nuclei is capable of currently doing, especially if you have internal context in relation to that, and the fact that those tools often live outside of your environment. I mean, even when you deploy CSPM products, even in your own environment, it's going to be in a separate AWS account, or it's going to be separated away from your production environment, most likely. And you have no way of having that, internal, reference from like your office IP addresses versus external. And also in addition to that, a lot of those tools have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands maybe even 1 million alerts that you have to go through in order to get to a reasonable state that you can mature over time. And as I've sort of seen with attack surface assessments, that I strongly recommend you perform at least once manually if you've not done so already, and have a way of automating it. It provides significant more context as to what's in your environment, as Nuclei has additional templates that tell you certain misconfigurations associated to it. It is also really good at finding administrative panels, etc. And I don't think anybody can say with a significant amount of experience in the field that they haven't had one person in their company deploy some administrative panel publicly or over permissively.
Yeah.
And finding those are extremely difficult, even to this day. And there's no real like excellent mechanism of being able to do that with the context of your own company, as you may have your own internal tools with own administrative panels that you need to be able to detect.
And you're saying, so these, basically external scans do a better job of kind of finding panels and, admin controls and things like that. Whereas the CSPM, living more at the infrastructure layer, probably doesn't go into that. CNAP, which might go into that, is looking at it from an internal perspective and not from the attacker's point of view.
In a way, yes. And also, I would like to say a lot of companies still haven't moved away from the VPN model, not to say if it's good or bad or favoring one way or another, but like being able to run it from the context of your office IP space or a trusted context adds the additional context of, hey, what's my internal attack surface that a potential employee can exploit as an insider threat versus what an attacker can exploit. And also adding that context of being your own company and knowing what's sensitive and what's not, and having that additional context of maybe an internal route, maybe your own internal administrative tools. You definitely don't want those exposed, and no CSPM tool is going to have that sort of context that you have as a security professional at your own company.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A while ago I was talking to a CISO from a well-known large, let's call it digital finance brand. And I was talking to him about the challenges of automated remediation in cloud environments. And we were talking about, for instance, like, why isn't it acceptable that you would just apply a thing that says, if you have a policy internally that you have no S3 buckets open to the world, why shouldn't you deploy a rule that just says, oh, if I find an S3 bucket open, close it? And what he said to me was, it's all about context. If you don't understand, like, what that bucket is, what data is in that bucket, who opened it, and why, then you really lack that. So it's really interesting to hear your comments around that. I'm really curious about a couple of other things, and one is actually an organizational question. So the question that I have is, you go through this exercise, you scan, you condense down your results, you prioritize, you contextualize. What's the response when you go into, let's say, the development team, or you go into the application owners and you say, here's all the bad we found? What is the pushback? Because I can imagine that's not actually necessarily like a great conversation, and it's not a conversation that I think a lot of leaders are going to be happy to have. So yeah, what's the lessons learned, and maybe what's like some guidance and best practices around this?
I think it depends on the approach. So it's on how you're reaching out to the development team. If you are reaching out more of like, hey, here's everything we found, these are all bad, fix it now, you're going to get pushback because for them it's lacking context.
Pushback or ignored?
Both, probably.
Okay.
They will be like, okay, cool, we'll get back to it when we can, right? But you want to provide more context to them of, one, why it's that important, of like, why is this exposed endpoint that is revealing some data important for the company? And that's where you start slowly baking in the security culture as well there, not just to your security team, but to development of why it matters. It doesn't have to be always just like your regular web application vulnerabilities. It could be just exposure of certain data, exposure of panels. Why would an attacker care about it? Yeah. And that's where coming out from like what Jonathan said is doing both internal and external helps, because then you can say, okay, here's one external application that we have open that someone could use to get at least some internal access into our system, which now they can scale forward and get more customer data with our like administrative internal portals, because companies tend to usually have internal administration portal without authentication, and the logic there is it's behind VPN. Employees are going to be authenticated, and that's where like we see a lot of the breaches happening. You get one employee account, now you have access to hundreds of administrative portals that can do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So if you start showing value of like, from this external facing panel that you may have, or external facing tool, software, whatever, and that's how they can go and start exploiting our internal resources, that shows them the value, and that's where you will start seeing more favorable conditions. Even when working at past companies, I think that's how we have approached it, is showing the impact. If you find a portal that has some kind of like a server-side request forgery, you show them, this is what I can do at the worst case scenario. I pulled our AWS credential that has access to some EC2 instance. Now I can go and hit another administrative portal. So you start showing them the chain, and they slowly start seeing that kind of attacker mindset or the attacker path of, this is where you start, this is where you end. And that shows a lot of impact to them, and that's where that also kind of pushes them, okay, we need to fix, because now we're putting both user data at risk and organization at risk for like lawsuits, breaches, and whatnot. That's kind of my experience with it.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to add to this just because it's so close to my heart. But nobody wants to hear that their baby is ugly. And including myself. When you build something and take the time, you put in a lot of effort, and there are a lot of engineering decisions that you make along the way. And nothing you do is ever perfect. And finding flaws in someone else's product as well as your own product is something you have to sort of show empathy for when doing so. Walk them through, understand the difficulty in what they're trying to implement, try to give them guidance as best you can, and try to approach it in the most empathetic way as possible. And I would say that building the security culture from the ground up is something that you should be doing regardless, and that'll really help in your communication. If you show that you're an outstanding engineer to the company in the way that you promote yourself, and you show that you're trying to help others, it will definitely be viewed differently. And also, like the VPN context, if there's an additional security control in place, it can be difficult communicating with other individuals when they say, hey, it's behind a VPN, or there's this compensating control that's in place. While it may reduce the impact, it doesn't eliminate the issue. And defense in depth is always something that's going to be difficult to communicate across. But something that, showing empathy and communicating and advising them on common attack paths and scenarios definitely really helps.
I think this point about empathy is one that we cannot make often enough here in the cybersecurity community. I think there's been, a perception for too long that cybersecurity is the Department of No, right? And it is, that group that nobody ever likes working with and nobody ever wants to talk to. But it is, the reality is that you've got to protect the organization, and you hire cybersecurity people for a good reason. One of our lead investors likes to make a comment that cybersecurity is national security. And while I would be the first to say not everybody works in a context that is national security related, I think the security of each organization shouldn't be taken for granted. So I really appreciate that perspective on empathy in particular. We're coming up to the end of the episode, but I know that you guys are both working on really interesting things. So I want to give you both the opportunity to just kind of say a little bit about what you're working on and tell people where they can find it.
Yeah, so I have been building similar to what we were talking about, scanning and whatnot, like an attack surface management. So that's solving the issues with like the context providing there, similar to like, instead of showing million data points, million alerts to the customers, it's more of, here are things that's really important to you. Here are things that you should really care about. Right. And that's going like attack surface. It's such a, in my opinion, it's such a vague word now.
Yes.
Previously, 5-6 years ago, it was your domain and your IP and your network. Now it's your SaaS providers, your cloud, your domain. And that's where a lot of the historical ASM tools are slowly getting behind, is the SaaS security side of it is being missed. Just last week, we had all the Snowflake incidents of credential stuffing attacks, companies getting breached from that. We are seeing misconfigurations that are leaking data, whether it's through like S3 bucket or a database or whatnot. And that's what like I'm trying to solve. So if you just go to ophionsecurity.com, you can see our product. You can get a trial, whatnot there, and we're more than happy to help organizations there.
And that's Ophion, spelled Ophion, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great, awesome. And that's a .com or a .io or a .ai? Okay,
so awesome. If you go to ophionsecurity.com, you'll see our all of our stuff, our blog posts, everything there.
Awesome. Jonathan?
Yeah, and my company is Security Runners, where we specialize in live fire security exercises, in which we go in and help you perform sort of like a tabletop exercise, but with actual incidents that can occur. And one of those scenarios is things like accidentally exposing administrative panels as well. And spent a lot of time on building out exercises. And here at Forward CloudSec, I spoke on releasing an open source tool that allows engineers to perform security chaos engineering exercises, allowing them to perform over 50 different exercises in which they can deploy via Terraform and sort of get an understanding of how they'll respond to common breach scenarios within the industry.
Awesome. And what's the open source package called?
It is called Cloud Commotion. So github.com/security-runners/Cloud Commotion.
Okay. And the company is Security Runners.
securityrunners.io.
All right. Well, Jonathan, Rojan, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber. Please stay tuned for the next episode. And in the meantime, sharing is caring. Rate, review, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Tell your friends about it, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.